Okay, so today I'm going to talk about neuroaesthetics. Before I start my lecture, there's one announcement, and I'm sure you all hear this every time you enter a class these days. There is a course evaluation, and if you could fill one out, it just takes a few minutes. It'll help in deciding whether this course could be continued next year or not. So if you could do that, that'll be great. Okay. So, neuroaesthetics, it's a combination of two words, neuro and aesthetics. So you probably know where neuro comes from. It's the brain cells. What is aesthetics? It's just a second. Okay, so let's talk about what is aesthetics. It comes from the Greek term of perception. And in 1750, it has been used to define the study of sensory knowledge. But soon, the meaning got switched to the universal concept of beauty as appears in Nature and Art by Immanuel Kant. And that's the way we understand aesthetics today. And philosophers have used the term aesthetics to define this subdiscipline of philosophy, which is that of the arts. And the connection between aesthetics and our brain has been raised pretty recently. And this relationship is nicely summarized in this statement. So let me just read that to you. The artist is, in a sense, a neuroscientist, exploring the potentials and capacities of the brain, though with different tools. How such creations can arouse aesthetic experience can only be fully understood in neural terms. Such an understanding is now well within our reach. It's by Sam Arzeki, who's a neuroscientist, and this statement was made around 20 years ago. And did we make a lot of progress? Now, do we have an understanding of aesthetics in terms of neural mechanisms? The short answer is not really, as you might have guessed. So today, I'm going to give you an overview of the field by presenting you a couple of different approaches that are taken by researchers in this field. The first part of the lecture we will look at some of the medical cases, some anecdotes from patients with brain-related injury who has an altered artistic experience or altered aesthetics. The second part, we will look at and criticize some of the experimental research that is done in the field of neuroaesthetics. And then I'm going to present you some ideas that was proposed by, what's his name? Ramachandra in 1999 about his thoughts on the principle behind experiencing art, some of the science behind why we appreciate certain art objects and why we are attracted to beauty. And lastly, I will give you a presentation, a brief review about the book that Marge Livingstone, who is a vision scientist, wrote a couple of years ago. And it is this book. It's called Vision and Art. And originally when I organized this lecture, I really wanted her to come to give the lecture today, but she couldn't, so I'm kind of stepping in for her. So the last part of the presentation mostly is about this book, and I'm using her figures as a reference. So just to let you know. Okay, so before there were techniques to look at neurons or look at the brain, so before the neuroimaging techniques were developed, the only way for people to dissect the function of the brain was through lesion studies. And Phineas Gage's case is the hallmark case of all lesion studies because he made such a remarkable recovery and it was documented pretty well. And a lot of people use his case when introducing the idea of lesion studies. So let me do that for you too. So he used to be a construction worker who built railroad tracks. And in 1848, he was involved in this horrible accident when he was trying to blast through a bed of rocks. This long iron rod got pierced through his head. So this is a reconstruction of the injury. So you can see the rod piercing through his left cheek and exiting out on the top of his skull. And what was remarkable is the fact that he never lost consciousness during this accident. He remained conscious. He didn't really thought that injury was that big of a deal. Once the doctors arrived at his hotel, the doctors were terrified to see that he was pretty much every time he sneezed, there were like ounces of brain coming out of his head, falling down to the floor. But he was like, "I'm okay, I'm okay." So even from the start, it was pretty amazing. And he actually made a very nice recovery. And after a month since his accident, he was able to return to work. But the strange thing happened, and this is reported by his coworkers. They say that his personality changed so drastically to an extent that they couldn't even recognize who he was. They say that it seemed like he couldn't control his animal instinct anymore. And people have been using his case as a support for this idea. Yeah. Idea of phrenology, which is, as I told you in previous lectures, the measurement of the brain and trying to tie like cognitive functions to the size of your skull. And back in the days, it was believed that at the top of your head, at the top of your forehead, there was area for veneration and benevolence. And that seemed like exactly what Phineas Gage was missing after the injury. And they hypothesized that his symptoms, his change in personality was happening because he lost this area of the brain. And that has been believed to be the case for a long time, but recently people have been re-looking at this case and re-examining some of the facts, and it seems like a lot of the parts are actually really exaggerated, especially if you think about the fact that he, after being fired from work, he left the United States and went to Chile, where he doesn't speak the language. And he lived there for 8 years, working as a long-distance stagecoach driver, interacting with customers and going along with everyone just fine there. So looking at that record, it seems like it was either exaggerated or it was a very temporary thing for his personality to change that way. But anyway, so there's a lot of discussion about using lesion studies to examine the brain, and it is recommended that we take caution when looking at these case studies. But nonetheless, it is very interesting. So one of the brain-related disorders that are associated with altered artistic experience is called frontotemporal dementia. It is a condition caused by progressive cell degeneration in the frontal and the temporal lobes. And it is symptomatically kind of similar to Alzheimer's disease. They show a change in personality and behavior. As the disease progresses, they lose restraint in personal relation and social life. And they also exhibit semantic dementia, which means that they can no longer understand meanings of words, and aphasia, so they lose words. They lose the ability to speak. And in very few cases of people who have FTD, who have developed FTD, they have this tendency to suddenly become artists. So this is an example from Anne Adams' work. Anne Adams, she used to be a scientist. She was a biologist. She never drew or painted before. She wasn't interested in arts. But as her FTD progressed, she got obsessed with expressing abstract thoughts through geometrical patterns. And this is an example where she was listening to a musical score written by Ravel. It's called Bolero. And this is her visual interpretation of that entire music. This is another example of her work. This is basically correlating different colored tiles to numbers of the pi. So this is a composition, and she calls this is how she interprets pi, the number pi. And there was a stylistic change as her disease progressed. So this is one of her very last works. This was produced when she was completely silent. She couldn't speak, but the later works tended to be very detailed-oriented, and they were representational. So you see some shift as the disease progresses. This is another work from another person who has FTD. These are figurines painted by an individual, and you can, again, see the geometrical patterns that you've seen in Anne Adams' work. This is an example of how the style of the artist changes as the disease progressed. So this is before FTD developed. This artist used a pretty representational way of sketching out his environment. And then it turned into very abstract and colorful forms of art. This is another artist whose style changed with her dementia. So she used to be trained in traditional Asian paintings, but after the disease onset, her paintings became very abstract and color-rich, very expressive. Another disorder that is associated in this sudden onset of willingness to create is called acquired obsessive-compulsive personalities. So this is basically obsessive-compulsive disorder, which came out after the brain injury of a person. Like OCD, it shows anxiety caused by intrusive thoughts. Patients show excessive, uncontrollable washing, cleaning, checking, hoarding, attachment to rituals, preoccupation with certain thoughts, and again, in few cases, there is a sudden onset of urge to create art. And the most famous case of this disease is Franco Magnani. So he never painted, he never even went to the museum, and suddenly after the onset of this disease caused by his encephalitis, he started to create, he started to get this very obsessive with his hometown back in Italy. It's called town of Pontito, and he couldn't stop talking about this town, and all he did was talk about his childhood in his town in very detailed manner. And these are some of the landscapes of that town that he created just sitting in his room. So there was no reference point. There was no pictures that he looked at. And what is especially amazing is when people actually went to this town and brought back photographs, it looked exactly like his paintings. So that's pretty amazing. This is another example of artist who suffered from acquired OCD after brain injury. And he used to be a truck driver, and he never went to the museum again, never interested in art. And suddenly he's had this urge to draw, and in his early paintings you can see like some of the hemispheric blindness. You see there is a split in the compositions, and oftentimes he's leaving out the left visual field, meaning that his injury was on his right hemisphere of his brain. And he is, I don't know, it seems like he's progressing as an artist. And he's now doing a lot of sculptural works in addition to two-dimensional works. And for me personally, the most interesting examples comes from savants on the autism spectrum disorder. So autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder which is diagnosed early on, around ages of 3 or 5 years old. The characteristic of autism includes impaired social interaction, communication, and restricted and repetitive behavior, which varies greatly in range. Recently, the hyper or hyporeactivities to sensory input has been added to the diagnosis tool. And we know through a lot of research that it is a very complex disorder that involves a lot of genes and a lot of genetic pathways. And among the people who are on this spectrum, few of them are savants, meaning that they show like genius intelligence in a very particular area. And some of them show geniuses in art. So this is a very famous example. His name is Stephen Wiltshire. His obsession is in cars and architecture. And this is one of his many panoramic cityscapes that was created after he took one trip on the helicopter around the city. And then he went to his studio and spent a week just in his studio creating this whole panorama of the city. And it is so accurate to the detail that you can actually count the number of windows on individual buildings and they will match up with the real thing. So I don't know how this happens, but it's pretty amazing. This is an example from David Barth, who's 12 years old. His obsession is with animals and insects, and he has an encyclopedic knowledge about these animals. Not only can he draw from memory all the different species, they recognize them by the Latin name. And I haven't found a reference, so this is not confirmed fact, but the way he arranges the different animals, I think it's according to the phylogenetic relationship between each other. Very interesting stuff. And these artistic savant abilities occur. It was made famous by this kid named Nadia, and she started drawing realistic horses since the age of 3. It's not always representational drawing that these autistic savants become capable of. Iris Grace, who is 5 years old, produced these very wonderful abstract paintings as part of her art therapy program. And Felix is obsessed with maps. And this is an imaginary cityscape that he created and drew a map of. It's a fully functional city, by the way. And it is, what's really interesting is the fact that for these autistic savants, once they grow up and through therapy they learn how to speak, their ability to draw these things, their obsession with drawing slowly decreases. And when they become young adults, all their ability just, they become normal. So we know there's something going on up there. In rare cases, we can actually pinpoint the region of brain that is affected by a disorder, and we can kind of make a connection with the art that the artistic output that they exhibit. So this is an example of a patient who suffered parietal lobe damage. So that's up here, and this is along the track where the visual pathway that is responsible for the where information, where locations are. This is where the detection of motion happens, for example. So we call this the where stream or the dorsal stream. So she has an effect in this dorsal stream. And when she was asked to draw a bicycle, a cross, and a clock, we can see that she knows what a bicycle is, and she knows the different components of a bicycle. She drew 2 wheels, a handle, a frame, a seat, but she has no ability to place them in the right relationship with each other, location-wise, on the paper. So it becomes this rather senseless gibberish. And the same is true for even a very simple thing like a cross. She doesn't know where to put each line, and she doesn't understand how each line goes with each other to create this form. So she has trouble drawing out what she knows what it looks like. And this isn't, I thought this was really interesting because after she drew the face of the clock, she started numbering the numbers here, and it was going okay, and then suddenly she lost track, and now she's drawing a spiral. So, in contrast to this, there is another stream that goes along your temporal lobe. It's called the Watt pathway, and that is where object recognition happens and facial recognition, for example. And this is an example from a patient who suffered the damage right on that stream, in the ventral stream. When he was asked to copy the drawings on the left, he did a very good job of doing that, but he didn't understand what each objects were. But he knew what a tea bag was. He could describe what the function of the tea bag and when he would use it, but looking at it on the paper, he couldn't get that is a tea bag because it was missing some information in the middle. So he failed to recognize any objects that he drew. So what happens after we have this technology of imaging the brain? People got interested in some of the structural differences between people who are so-called creative and normal people. And this is a paper that summarizes a number of these studies that look at people who scored high on the psychological test of creativity and people who scored normal average on the test. And the blue areas are where we see lower brain integrity for people who are more creative, higher brain, and the red is where we see higher brain integration for people who are more creative. But all in all, I'm showing you because I want to emphasize the fact that there seems to be no specific area of the brain that's responsible for creativity. Not only that, our conventional wisdom about the fact of our belief about the left brain being the analytical part and the right brain being the more creative, that is completely wrong. This idea actually originated from patients who have their corpus callosum, which is the bridge area that connects the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, cut, usually because of uncontrollable seizure. So that operation is done to localize the uncontrollable activity to at least one hemisphere, so that so to prevent the whole brain from being affected by these uncontrollable seizures. And in those patients who have the cut corpus callosum, they saw that in their left visual field, which is processed by their right brain, does a better job of solving creative problems, while when presented a mathematical problem on the left visual field, they would do a better job solving it than vice versa. So that's where this idea comes from, that the fact that this is analytical and this is creative. But we know that there is a lot of communication going on in both of those processes, and we can't really isolate one functionality to one hemisphere. Okay, so creativity does not involve a single brain region or a single side of the brain. So what is it? It seems like, at least according to the researchers who conducted that review that I showed you, it seems like the cognitive function of creativity involves neural hubs and networks. And an example of those networks is the imagination network, what they call the imagination network, colored in red, and the green executive attention network. And they are, in their review, they are referring to a process, theoretical process for creativity. It's called the blind variation selective retention. Basically, it's saying that creativity happens in two processes. First being generation of all these random ideas that is unpredictable, so that involves the red imagination network. And the second one being the selection of those that are useful, so that it retains those ideas that are useful, and that involves the executive attention network. But let's leave creativity for a few moments and let's focus on aesthetics. And for aesthetics, I want to talk about the concept of beauty a little bit, because aesthetics experience revolves around the concept of beauty. And one of the tough things about studying beauty as a subject matter, especially in science, is the fact that beauty is inherently subjective in nature. But we know that all of us feel some kind of a pleasure or displeasure elicited by looking at an artwork. And that's where the researchers decided to tap into. We think that there must be an area in the brain that corresponds to recognizing beauty in artworks as a precursor to the reward system. They want to explain why we feel pleasure, so they're bringing in the reward system here, the limbic system. And in 2011, this study got published, and the authors claim to have found the beauty center. And it's in this, deep in this frontal area. It's called medial orbitofrontal cortex. Yeah. And what they did is they brought in participants to their studies. They asked the participants to rate 10 different images and 10 different sound samples from a range from being ugly to beautiful. And they compared the brain responses in using fMRI corresponding to the beautiful stimulus versus the ugly stimulus, and saw the relative difference between the two, thus identifying the area that only responded to when the participant was looking or hearing a beautiful stimuli. And before moving in and talking about some of the caveats of the experimental design of this study, I want to tell you a little bit about the technique itself, fMRI. So fMRI, it stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. What it's measuring is the bold contrast. It stands for blood oxygen level dependent contrast. It is an indirect measurement of neural activity, because what we are measuring is the change in the amount of oxygenated hemoglobin, and that causes magnetic susceptibility of blood, and we're measuring the change of that susceptibility in this giant magnet. So what we are seeing in the images are not actually neural activity, they are oxygenated, levels of oxygenation. This technique is being widely used in brain research and in clinical studies because it is non-invasive and it is safe. It is relatively easy to use. All you have to do is go into the giant donut magnet and stay still for a few minutes. And also, very important for applying for funds, it produces a very convincing image of the brain activity. So you can just point to the highlighted area saying, look at here, there's the activity. But it seems like the whole rave behind fMRI imaging has been kind of going down these days, because probably people know all the pitfalls in using this technique, which are the fact that the resolution, both spatial and temporal, is limited by hemodynamics, by flow of blood, rather than the actual neural activity. So there's no way we can go beyond the physical properties of the blood and actually look at a very small area, for example. All we get is always an approximate of a region and time. And because it is not a direct measurement, we have no idea of what the nature of that activity is. And neuronal signals usually involves two different signals. It can be either excitatory or inhibitory, but using this technique, we don't know if it's excitatory or inhibitory, nor do we know the directionality, whether if it's feed forward or feedback response. And because the level of the signal that we see as the end product of this technique, it is a relative measurement. So for example, if we have a global activation of the brain, this will unlikely be able to detect that. Beyond the limits set by the tool itself, there are some of the challenges in analyzing these neuroimaging methods, and one of them being the circular analysis. So what this means is you are basically selecting an area based on a conclusion that you already kind of drew. So in the process of defining the region of interest for analysis in these fMRI images, you are referring to the images that you are supposed to use for analysis, but you are already defining the area based on the result, and you're running the analysis again on that same region. So it's like it creates an exaggerated response, an exaggerated positive result. So it uses the same data for selection and selective analysis. One way to prevent this is to have a separate set of data for selection of the region of interest, and have another set of data to run the analysis on. But researchers usually don't do that. It takes a lot of time and money. If you write the hypothesis just right, you can pretty much make any statement true. This is an absurd statement that one of the researchers admittedly say that he just made it up, and he was able to use random fMRI data to prove this statement. The activity in region Y can account for the variance in speed with which subjects walk out of the experiment. So, and another thing to think about when looking at the results using fMRI is reverse inference. So basically, it follows the logic of so let's say task A activates cortical area Z. And we know that from previous studies that cognitive process X is engaged, Z is active. And logically, it makes sense for us to conclude that cognitive process X is engaged during task A. But to make this a true statement, a deductively true statement, what you need to know is whether Z is only active when cognitive process X is engaged. Z cannot be active when other processes are going on. And based on using reverse inference, we can make some weird statements like pup suckling is more rewarding than cocaine, which is actually a quote from a paper. So they're assuming that the area that they see in response to pup suckling in mice is responding to the same cognitive process that they see when the mice is exposed to cocaine.